The courthouse loomed over the city skyline, its towering stone columns and arched windows casting long shadows over the people who walked beneath them. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and old legal texts, the weight of history pressing against every surface. The echoes of hurried footsteps and murmured conversations reverberated through the marble halls, a symphony of tension and expectation that played out daily within these walls. For JD Vance, the setting was familiar. He had spent years navigating courtrooms, first as a law student absorbing every nuance of legal argumentation, then as a public figure defending the values he held dear. But today was different. Today, he wasn't here as a legislator, a commentator, or a best-selling author dissecting the struggles of the working class. Today, he was here as a defendant. The case against him was straightforward, at least on the surface. A regulatory violation, a fine imposed for an alleged misstep, a bureaucratic tangle that had somehow escalated to a full-blown legal confrontation. The kind of thing that might have been settled quietly with a payment and an apology had the circumstances been different. But JD had never been one to accept penalties blindly, especially not when they reeked of something deeper than legal oversight. And so, he had chosen to fight. The courtroom was packed. Reporters hunched over their notebooks, their pens scratching against paper as they whispered speculative headlines to one another. Ordinary citizens filled the gallery seats, some drawn by the allure of witnessing a public figure defend himself, others there to see if the man who had once written of hardship and resilience still possessed the same fire when standing alone before the law. At the front of the room, behind an imposing wooden bench, sat Judge Eleanor Prescott, a woman of formidable intellect and a reputation for unyielding interpretations of the law. She had built her career on her unwavering commitment to judicial integrity. Her black robe seemed almost too rigid, her thin lips pressed together as she flipped through the thick file in front of her, each page filled with the intricate details of the case. "Mr. Vance," she finally said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's murmurs. "You stand accused of violating a series of financial disclosure regulations, an infraction that carries a significant fine and potentially additional legal consequences. Do you understand the charges against you?" JD stood, his gaze steady. He had faced scrutiny before, weathered the harshest criticism of both the media and his political opponents, but this moment required something different. A precise, calculated approach, a deep understanding of the very system that sought to penalize him. "I do, Your Honor," he replied, his voice even measured, "and I intend to challenge them." A ripple moved through the gallery, a shift of bodies as people leaned in, sensing that this would not be the routine hearing they had expected. Judge Prescott arched an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" she asked, her tone skeptical. JD took a slow breath, the wheels of his mind already turning at full speed. The law, he knew, was not just about statutes and precedents. It was about interpretation, about the intricate dance between intent and execution. He had spent years studying its mechanics, the subtle ways in which language could be manipulated, how power could be disguised in the folds of legal jargon. "Your Honor," he began, stepping forward slightly, "the basis of the fine rests on a misapplication of regulatory statutes. The prosecution asserts that my disclosures failed to meet the necessary requirements. But if you examine the specific language of the statute, Section 12, Clause B, you'll find that the definitions provided are ambiguous at best. The law in question does not clearly outline the standard against which my filings are being judged." Judge Prescott leaned back slightly, considering his words. "Are you suggesting that ambiguity in the statute absolves you of responsibility?" "I'm suggesting," JD replied, his voice unwavering, "that the burden of clarity falls on the regulatory body that drafted the law, not the individuals expected to comply with it. A system that imposes penalties based on unclear guidelines is not a system of justice, but a system of arbitrary enforcement." A low murmur spread through the room. Even those who had come expecting little more than a procedural ruling could sense that something unexpected was unfolding. The judge tapped her pen against the bench, A brief pause before she spoke again. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone edged with curiosity, "you seem to have a rather comprehensive understanding of the law. I assume you've prepared a full defense based on these arguments?" JD allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I have, Your Honor. In fact, I've outlined a series of precedents where similarly vague statutes have been successfully challenged. I would be more than happy to walk the court through them." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a carefully curated air of authority, cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he interjected, his voice carrying the faintest hint of irritation. "While Mr. Vance is clearly well-versed in legal rhetoric, the fact remains that he failed to meet the outlined requirements. His argument may be compelling, but it does not change the facts of the case." JD turned slightly toward the prosecutor, his expression neutral. "With all due respect," he said, "facts without context are meaningless. If the law itself is flawed, then any enforcement of it becomes an exercise in selective punishment." The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. This was no longer just about a fine. It was about something far larger. The very nature of justice, the limitations of legal authority, the thin line between enforcement and exploitation. JD was forcing the court to consider not just whether he was guilty, but whether the system itself was acting in good faith. Judge Prescott exhaled slowly, studying him for a long moment before finally speaking. "Very well, Mr. Vance. You have my attention. Let's proceed." The tension in the room thickened, anticipation crackling like electricity in the air. The case had begun, but something more profound was unfolding. What had started as a simple legal dispute was rapidly transforming into a battle of intellect, of principles, of the very foundations upon which the judicial system rested. And JD Vance was ready for it. The courtroom had taken on a different atmosphere, a subtle yet undeniable shift in energy that pulsed beneath the surface of the proceedings. What had begun as a simple procedural hearing now carried the weight of something far greater, something that neither the judge nor the prosecution had fully anticipated. The spectators, many of whom had arrived expecting nothing more than another high-profile figure attempting to evade accountability, now leaned forward with rapt attention, drawn into the intricate web of legal argumentation unfolding before them. JD Vance stood with the composed confidence of a man who understood the terrain beneath his feet. The law, for all its rigid structures and formalities, was not an immovable force. It was fluid, shaped by those who wielded it with precision and insight. He knew that statutes were often written with ambiguity not out of negligence, but by design, allowing those in power to apply them selectively, bending enforcement to suit their interests. This hearing, though nominally about a fine, was really about something much deeper, whether the law itself could be used as a tool of control rather than justice. Judge Eleanor Prescott adjusted her glasses, her sharp eyes scanning the documents before her as she considered the arguments already presented. She was a woman known for her meticulous approach to the law, someone who prided herself on intellectual rigor and a commitment to fairness. But even she could not ignore the reality unfolding before her. "Mr. Vance," she said finally, her voice steady but measured, "you claim that the statute lacks the necessary clarity for proper enforcement. However, the prosecution argues that regardless of ambiguity, your filings failed to meet the expected standard. Would you care to elaborate on why you believe the standard is inadequate?" JD took a slow breath, allowing the silence to stretch for a fraction longer than necessary, ensuring that every ear in the room was attuned to his next words. "Your Honor," he began, his tone carrying the weight of careful deliberation, "the essence of justice is consistency. If a law is to be enforced, it must be applied uniformly, without room for arbitrary interpretation. However, in this case, the regulatory body has imposed penalties selectively, punishing some while allowing others to proceed without scrutiny under the same ambiguous guidelines. That is not the rule of law. It is the rule of discretion, which is far more dangerous." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a hushed wave of agreement mixed with surprise. Many had expected legal posturing, the kind of deflections common in cases where public figures sought to escape responsibility. But this was something else entirely. JD was not merely defending himself. He was indicting the very mechanism that had sought to entrap him. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Richard Calloway, adjusted his tie and stepped forward, his posture stiff with the awareness that he was no longer dealing with a typical defense strategy. "Your Honor," Calloway said, attempting to keep his voice even. "While Mr. Vance has provided a compelling critique of the legal system, the fact remains that he is the one on trial today. His argument does not change the reality that his financial disclosures failed to comply with the outlined procedures." JD turned toward Calloway, his expression calm, almost contemplative, as though weighing the full measure of his opponent before choosing to engage. "With respect, Mr. Calloway," JD replied, his voice deliberate, "the issue is not whether I followed an unclear rule, but whether an unclear rule should be enforced at all. If the prosecution is arguing that compliance is mandatory, then it must first prove that the law provides an unambiguous framework against which compliance can be measured. Otherwise, we are not debating whether I followed the law. We're debating whether the law itself is sound." The judge's gaze flickered with something close to intrigue. She was not a woman easily impressed, but even she could recognize when an argument carried the weight of something irrefutable. "Let's examine precedent," JD continued, stepping closer to the center of the courtroom, commanding the space with a presence that seemed to still the very air around him. In the case of Harrison versus United States, the Supreme Court ruled that vague statutory language cannot be the basis for punitive action. The court determined that if a regulation lacks clarity, the fault lies with the legislative or regulatory body, not with the individual expected to adhere to it. That decision established that penalties cannot be imposed based on uncertain interpretations. Calloway shifted uncomfortably, the corners of his mouth tightening as he realized the argument was airtight. If the judge ruled in JD's favor, it would not merely absolve him of responsibility. It would call into question the entire enforcement mechanism behind the regulation itself. Judge Prescott steepled her fingers, her brow furrowed in thought. She had presided over countless cases, had heard more arguments than she could count, but this was something different. It was not often that a defendant stood before her not merely to seek exoneration, but to challenge the very foundation of the case against him. "Mr. Calloway," she said finally, turning her attention to the prosecutor, "do you have a response to the defense's use of precedent?" Calloway cleared his throat, glancing briefly at his notes before looking up. "Your Honor, while the defense has cited Harrison, we must consider the principle of administrative deference. Courts have historically granted agencies the authority to interpret their own regulations when statutory language is unclear. This is a fundamental aspect of how regulatory frameworks function." JD allowed himself a small smile, the kind that carried neither arrogance nor hostility, but the quiet assurance of a man who had anticipated every move his opponent might make. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth yet unyielding, "the prosecution refers to administrative deference as though it grants limitless authority to regulatory agencies. However, in Kaiser versus Wilkie, the Supreme Court clarified that deference to agency interpretation is only valid when the regulation itself is genuinely ambiguous and the agency's interpretation is reasonable. In this case, the agency's interpretation has been applied inconsistently, proving that even they do not fully understand their own rule." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, the weight of the argument pressing down on everyone who bore witness to it. Even Judge Prescott, whose face had remained impassive for most of the hearing, exhaled slowly, the faintest flicker of realization passing through her features. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, the balance of power in the room shifted. This was no longer a case of a judge assessing the guilt or innocence of a single man. It had become a test of whether the law itself could withstand its own scrutiny. "Your Honor," JD said, his voice steady, "I ask that this case not be evaluated solely on whether I followed a rule that even its enforcers struggle to define. I ask that this court consider whether justice is truly served when laws are written with ambiguity, enforced with inconsistency, and defended with convenience. The room held its breath, the weight of his words settling like dust in the still air. Judge Prescott leaned back in her chair, her fingers pressed together in thought, the slightest nod betraying the recognition that this case was no longer about a fine. It was about the fundamental principles upon which justice itself stood. JD remained where he was, standing in the eye of the storm he had conjured, waiting for the next wave to break. And when it did, it would determine far more than his own fate. The courtroom, once filled with the restless shifting of bodies and the scratching of pens against notepads, now existed in a state of expectant silence. It was not the silence of routine legal proceedings, where words were exchanged in a dry and predictable rhythm, but something heavier, something that felt like the pause before the strike of a gavel that could change everything. Judge Eleanor Prescott, a woman known for her unflinching adherence to judicial discipline, remained unmoving as she considered the gravity of what had been placed before her. The fine imposed on JD Vance, initially treated as a minor administrative penalty, had unraveled into a case questioning the very framework upon which regulatory enforcement was built. JD stood unwavering, his expression one of quiet intensity, as if he could see the complex mechanisms of the law shifting in real time before him. He understood what was happening, not just the legal argument at hand, but the broader implications of his defense. He was no longer fighting against a fine. He was forcing the court to reckon with the precarious balance between legal authority and overreach, between bureaucratic enforcement and the fundamental principles of justice. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, was not an incompetent man. He had built his career on dissecting the arguments of those who sought to evade accountability, mastering the art of turning legal technicalities into weapons against even the most well-prepared defendants. But today, he found himself caught in the unfamiliar position of being the one forced onto the defensive. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the courtroom's momentum. "Your Honor," he began, carefully choosing his words, "while Mr. Vance has made a compelling case regarding statutory ambiguity, we must not lose sight of the broader issue at hand. The intent of financial disclosure laws is to ensure transparency and prevent misconduct. To suggest that enforcement should be halted simply because the language of the statute contains some level of ambiguity is to undermine the very purpose of these regulations." JD allowed the prosecutor's words to settle before he responded. He did not rush, nor did he interrupt. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make it clear that he was not reacting out of impulse, but out of deliberation. "With all due respect, Mr. Calloway," JD said, his voice firm but absent of condescension, "intent does not equate to clarity. While the purpose of financial disclosure laws is indeed to ensure transparency, their effectiveness depends entirely on whether those subject to them can reasonably comply. If a law is written in such a way that its meaning shifts depending on who is interpreting it, then it is not a safeguard against misconduct. It is a tool for selective enforcement." He paused, glancing toward Judge Prescott, whose gaze remained sharp and unreadable. "This is not a question of whether transparency is important," he continued, his words measured, "but whether the government has the right to impose penalties based on regulations that even its own agencies struggle to interpret consistently. A legal system that allows for fluid definitions of compliance does not promote fairness. It promotes arbitrary power." The weight of his argument settled over the room like an unseen force, pressing down on those who had come expecting to see a man simply defend himself against a financial penalty. The reality was now unmistakable. This was no longer a discussion about a single case. This was about precedent, about whether the law served as a tool for justice or as a weapon for control. Judge Prescott, for all her years on the bench, had rarely been placed in a position where a defendant had turned the court's scrutiny back upon the system itself. She leaned forward slightly, her fingertips pressing together as she studied JD. "Mr. Vance," she said finally, her voice carrying the precise balance of curiosity and caution, You are well-versed in legal precedent, and you have provided compelling arguments regarding statutory ambiguity. However, let us step away from the abstract for a moment. If you believe the law, as written, is flawed, what remedy do you propose? JD inhaled slowly, recognizing the significance of the question. The judge was not merely asking him to defend himself. She was inviting him to provide a solution, a rare acknowledgement that his argument had not only been heard, but had struck at something deeper within the foundations of legal interpretation. The remedy, JD said, his voice unwavering, is judicial restraint when ambiguity exists. Courts have long held that when a statute is unclear, rulings should favor the defendant, not the prosecution. It is not the responsibility of private citizens to decipher regulations that fail to define their own terms. If the law is flawed, it is the duty of lawmakers and regulatory bodies to correct it, not to place the burden of interpretation on those subject to enforcement. Judge Prescott studied him carefully, her expression betraying no immediate reaction. She turned toward Calloway, who had begun rifling through his notes with the stiff movements of a man searching for an angle that had yet to present itself. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her tone still even, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who expected precision, "does the prosecution dispute that the statute in question lacks explicit definitional clarity?" Calloway hesitated for a fraction too long, the courtroom's silence amplifying the weight of his next words. He knew that to argue against JD's claim would be to deny what was already evident in the text of the statute itself. "No, Your Honor," he admitted, his voice measured, "we do not dispute that certain elements of the statute leave room for interpretation. However, we maintain that enforcement discretion is a necessary function of regulatory oversight." JD tilted his head slightly, the hint of a knowing smile playing at the edges of his expression. He had anticipated this response. "Enforcement discretion," he said, his tone firm but free of malice, "is not a substitute for due process. If the government is allowed to impose penalties based on rules that remain open to interpretation, then we no longer have a system of law. We have a system of administrative decree. That is not governance. That is rule by fiat." Another murmur spread through the gallery, and even the reporters, long accustomed to legal maneuvering, found themselves struggling to keep up with the rapid unraveling of what had once seemed like an open-and-shut case. Judge Prescott took a slow breath, her expression unreadable, but her posture revealing the careful consideration of someone aware that the implications of her ruling would extend far beyond the confines of the courtroom. JD remained still, his presence steady, as though he had already accepted whatever decision would come next. He was not here to plead for leniency, nor to beg for the mercy of the court. He was here to argue a point, to defend a principle, to challenge a system that too often relied on the assumption that those standing before the bench lacked the knowledge or resolve to push back. And for the first time since the proceedings had begun, it was clear that the weight of the gavel was no longer solely in the hands of the judge. It had, in some subtle but undeniable way, shifted into his own. The courtroom, which had once been filled with the routine hum of legal proceedings, now carried an intensity that bordered on the palpable. The gallery remained transfixed, the reporters now scribbling furiously, their pens racing to capture every word, every nuance, every shift in the balance of power. What had begun as a minor case of regulatory enforcement had transformed into something far greater, an examination of whether the law was truly serving justice or merely serving those who wielded it. JD Vance stood in the center of it all, unmoving, his posture revealing no sign of unease. He understood better than most that legal battles were rarely won through sheer rhetoric alone. Precision was key, timing was everything, and most crucial of all, the ability to see the argument not only as it stood now, but as it would unfold in the minds of those listening. He had built his case carefully, brick by brick, each statement reinforcing the next, until even the judge seemed to feel the weight of what had been presented. Judge Eleanor Prescott, whose reputation as a stringent enforcer of legal discipline had been well earned, exhaled slowly as she turned the full weight of her attention toward the prosecution. Her gaze, though not unkind, carried the unspoken expectation that what followed would meet the same level of intellectual rigor that JD had displayed. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice measured, "the defense has raised significant concerns about the ambiguity of the statute in question. In response, you have asserted that enforcement discretion remains necessary for regulatory oversight. However, I must ask, at what point does discretion become arbitrary?" The question lingered in the air, thick with implication, its weight not lost on anyone present. Richard Calloway, whose experience in the courtroom was undeniable, squared his shoulders slightly, as if bracing himself against the force of an argument he had not expected to encounter with such ferocity. He knew that the foundation upon which the government's case rested had begun to show cracks, and if he could not find a way to solidify it now, the entire structure might collapse beneath him. "Your Honor," Calloway began, his voice carefully controlled, "discretion is not the absence of law, but rather the mechanism through which regulations are applied in a way that considers real-world complexities. Without enforcement discretion, the legal system would become inflexible, incapable of addressing the nuances that emerge when laws meet lived experience." JD did not shift, did not so much as blink as Calloway spoke. He listened carefully, absorbing every word, recognizing the prosecutor's attempt to reframe the argument, to steer the conversation back toward the government's authority rather than the inherent flaws in the law itself. Judge Prescott, however, was not easily swayed. "I understand the necessity of enforcement discretion," she replied, her voice steady, "but that does not address the core issue raised by the defense. If a law is so vaguely written that even the enforcing body struggles to apply it consistently, does it not follow that such a law fails in its purpose?" Calloway hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but in a room as attuned to the moment as this one, even the smallest pause felt seismic. JD saw the opening. He stepped forward slightly, not in aggression, not in defiance, but with the quiet certainty of a man who understood that this was the moment upon which everything hinged. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent his life studying not just what the law dictated, but how it functioned in practice. "The prosecution has argued that discretion is necessary for the law to function effectively. But discretion without clear legal standards is not governance. It is judgment by preference. And when the government reserves the right to penalize some while excusing others under identical circumstances, it ceases to be a neutral arbiter of justice." A murmur passed through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, the weight of the argument pressing down upon every person who had gathered to witness the proceedings. Judge Prescott studied him carefully, her brow furrowing slightly as she considered his words. "Mr. Vance," she said, "if the statute in question is as flawed as you suggest, what is your position on its enforcement moving forward? Are you arguing that all penalties imposed under its authority should be dismissed?" JD knew the question was more than a legal inquiry. It was a test. "I am arguing," he replied, his voice steady, "that penalties cannot be imposed when the rules themselves are unclear. I am not seeking to nullify the purpose of financial disclosure laws. I am asking that the law be held to the same standard it imposes upon those who must comply with it: clarity, precision, and consistency." Judge Prescott remained silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that carried the weight of deliberation, the careful balancing of legal doctrine against the undeniable reality presented before her. Finally, she turned once more to Calloway. "Does the prosecution wish to offer a rebuttal?" Calloway straightened, his fingers lightly tapping against the legal pad before him, as if searching for the words that might undo the damage inflicted upon his argument. He inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier confidence. "The prosecution has no further rebuttal at this time." A ripple passed through the gallery, a wave of restrained but unmistakable energy, as though every person present had collectively realized the tide had turned. JD Vance did not smile, did not gloat, did not so much as shift in his stance. He simply met the judge's gaze, his expression revealing nothing but the quiet understanding that what had happened here today was something rare, the moment when the law was forced to confront itself. Judge Prescott tapped her gavel lightly against the bench, signaling that the court would recess for deliberation. The audience, which had held itself in tense anticipation, finally exhaled as though collectively realizing they had been holding their breath. As JD gathered his papers, aware that the final decision had not yet been made, he could feel the weight of the moment settle over him. Not as a burden, but as confirmation that he had done exactly what he had set out to do. He had not simply defended himself. He had forced the court to question whether justice had ever truly been served. And now, as the judge prepared to render her final verdict, the answer to that question would no longer be his to give. The courtroom had become a crucible of silent anticipation, the tension thick enough to make even the most seasoned observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of deliberation hung in the air, the kind of moment where time seemed to slow, where the outcome felt both inevitable and entirely uncertain. JD Vance remained composed, his posture unwavering, his expression one of quiet confidence, though not arrogance. He had presented his case not as an attempt to evade responsibility, but as a demand for the legal system to uphold the very principles upon which it was built. Judge Eleanor Prescott sat behind the towering bench, her gaze fixed on the legal documents before her, though it was clear her decision had already taken shape. The gavel rested in her hand, an unassuming object that held within it the power to affirm or dismantle everything that had transpired. She exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but carrying the weight of finality. This court has carefully considered the arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense. She began, her voice even deliberate. At its core, this case is not merely about regulatory compliance, but about the very nature of the law itself, its clarity, its consistency, and whether it can be justly enforced when ambiguity exists. She paused, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the expectant faces of those who had witnessed this extraordinary legal confrontation unfold. Some leaned forward, eager to hear a ruling that might reshape their understanding of justice, while others sat frozen, as if bracing for a verdict that could alter the trajectory of future legal battles. The prosecution has argued that enforcement discretion is a necessary function of regulatory oversight. Judge Prescott continued, her tone carefully measured, while the defense has countered that discretion, when applied to vague statutes, results in selective enforcement rather than equal application of the law. She turned her gaze toward JD, studying him for a long moment before speaking again. Mr. Vance, this court finds merit in your argument. A legal system that allows for penalties to be imposed under statutes that lack clear and objective standards does not serve justice. It serves convenience. It is not the responsibility of individuals to interpret ambiguous laws. It is the responsibility of lawmakers and regulatory bodies to ensure those laws are written with precision. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, subdued but unmistakable. Even those who had entered this space expecting a straightforward ruling now found themselves grappling with the realization that something far more profound had taken place. Therefore, Judge Prescott continued, her voice steady. This court rules that the fine imposed upon Mr. Vance shall be vacated. Furthermore, it is the recommendation of this court that the regulatory body responsible for this statute revise its language to provide the clarity necessary for proper enforcement moving forward. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room, the finality of the ruling settling over those who had witnessed it. Some in the gallery exchanged glances, recognizing that while the ruling had immediate implications for JD Vance, its true significance extended far beyond him. This was not merely a victory for one man. It was a statement on the fragility of justice when wielded carelessly, a reminder that power, when unchecked, could become indistinguishable from abuse. Richard Calloway, the prosecutor who had entered this case expecting a routine legal proceeding, now stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line as he processed the implications of what had just occurred. He had fought hard. But in the end, the argument had not been about whether JD had violated the law. It had been about whether the law itself had violated the fundamental principles of fairness. JD inclined his head slightly toward the judge, an acknowledgement of the gravity of her ruling. He had not sought personal vindication, nor had he aimed to undermine the legal system itself. His goal had always been singular and unwavering: to ensure that justice, when rendered, was not merely a performance of authority, but an exercise in truth. Judge Prescott lifted her gavel, bringing it down with a single decisive motion. "This court is adjourned." The moment the words left her lips, the atmosphere shifted. The murmur of hushed voices grew louder, reporters scrambling to finalize their notes, some already reaching for their phones to relay the ruling to their editors. Members of the public, some stunned by what they had just witnessed, others visibly satisfied, began filtering out of the gallery, their minds still processing the implications of what had just unfolded. JD turned, gathering his notes with the same calm deliberation that had carried him through the proceedings. He could feel the weight of eyes upon him, some filled with curiosity, others with reluctant admiration, as if recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that he was not simply another politician or public figure seeking to evade scrutiny. He was, at his core, a man who understood the law not as an abstract force, but as a weapon that, if wielded carelessly, could wound those it was meant to protect. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air greeted him, the sunlight casting long shadows across the marble steps. A cluster of reporters surged forward, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of questions, requests for comment, inquiries about what this ruling meant for future legal battles, speculations on whether this would set a precedent for other cases. JD raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "The ruling today," he said, his voice carrying over the noise, "was not about me. It was about whether justice can truly exist when the law is left open to interpretation by those who seek to enforce it. This case was never about avoiding responsibility. It was about demanding accountability from those who create and apply our laws." He let the words settle, watching as even the most aggressive reporters seemed to hesitate, as if absorbing the full meaning of what he had just said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps unhurried, his expression one of quiet resolve. The battle had been fought. The ruling had been made. But JD Vance knew that justice was never a single moment, never confined to the walls of a courtroom or the words of a single judge. It was a fight that existed in every law passed, in every precedent set, in every individual willing to stand before the system and demand that it live up to its own ideals. And in that fight, he had no intention of standing down.